I've always remembered that trip like it was yesterday. In my family, we had this tradition of getting together for big parties, lots of food, drinks, and cigarettes. It was just how things were with us. I was young at the time, but those gatherings always left a lasting impression on me. There was one place, though, that gave me the chills every time we visited, my grandparents' house. Whenever we went there, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My parents would always end up arguing during our visits, and it was never clear why. There were no big problems, no fights before we left for the trip, but as soon as we arrived, it was like the house brought out the worst in them. My mom used to say the place had bad energy, and as a kid, I didn't really understand what that meant. But I could feel it. This particular night, the whole family was gathered in the backyard. The smell of barbecue filled the air, and the adults were doing what they always did, laughing, drinking, and smoking. I stayed close to my mom, not wanting to wander too far, because something about that house always made me feel uneasy. That's when I noticed my uncle. He wasn't doing too well. He'd been drinking, as usual, but there was something different about him that night. He looked pale and unsteady, like he couldn't keep his balance. At first, no one paid much attention to him. It wasn't uncommon for him to get a little out of it during these parties. But this time, it felt more serious. He grabbed onto the side of the table, his face twisting like he was in pain. Then, out of nowhere, he started laughing. Not just a regular laugh, this was loud, almost like it wasn't coming from him. He stared up at the sky, his eyes wide, and everyone stopped talking. The sound of his laugh echoed through the yard, cutting through the music and chatter. It was terrifying. I'd never seen him like that before. As the night went on, things got even stranger. My uncle, who had a reputation for getting a bit out of control at family gatherings, started acting in a way that was more unsettling than usual. He was sitting quietly one moment, then suddenly, he looked like he was about to pass out. His face went pale, and he stumbled, grabbing onto a nearby chair to keep himself from falling over. Everyone around him noticed, and the party atmosphere shifted. At first, a few family members laughed it off, thinking maybe he just had a little too much to drink. But then he started laughing. Not the kind of laugh you hear when someone is telling a joke. This was different, loud, deep, and eerie. It didn't seem like it was coming from him at all. His eyes were wide, and he just stared up at the ceiling like something was up there that only he could see. I remember feeling this deep sense of dread, even as a kid. I could tell the adults were uneasy too. The conversation stopped, and people began whispering, exchanging worried glances. Then, without warning, my uncle walked over to the wall and started scratching it. He was clawing at it with so much force that I could hear the sound of his nails scraping against the surface. It made everyone freeze. His breathing grew heavier, and his movements became frantic, like he was trying to claw his way through the wall. Nobody knew what to do at first. Some of my family seemed scared, while others were confused, thinking maybe he was just messing with everyone. But deep down, I think we all knew something was very wrong. Things escalated so fast that I barely had time to process what was happening. My uncle's strange behavior took a terrifying turn. He suddenly collapsed onto the floor, his body shaking uncontrollably. His eyes rolled back, and he started mumbling things, horrible, twisted words that none of us could understand. It was like he wasn't himself anymore, like something else had taken over. Some of the family members thought he was faking it, that maybe it was just the alcohol or something else getting to him. But the way he convulsed on the ground, the things he was saying, it felt far too real. There was this tension hanging in the air, and I could feel everyone around me holding their breath, unsure of what to do. Then, in the middle of all this chaos, he suddenly shouted that he was going to grab a knife. He said he was going to come after all of us, me included. I was just a little kid back then, and the fear that washed over me in that moment is something I'll never forget. The adults quickly moved in, trying to hold him down, but he was still thrashing around, his face twisted in this awful, angry expression. That's when my grandmother stepped in. She rushed over to him, knelt down beside him, and started praying loudly. Her voice cut through the chaos, steady and strong, even though I could see the fear in her eyes. And somehow, miraculously, he began to calm down. Little by little, the tension in his body eased, and he stopped fighting against my family. After a few minutes, he lay still, breathing heavily but no longer saying those terrible things. It was like whatever had taken hold of him had let go. When he finally opened his eyes again, he seemed normal. Like nothing had happened at all. After what felt like an eternity, things finally seemed to settle down. My uncle, still exhausted from everything that had happened, was helped to his room to rest. Everyone was shaken, but we all hoped the worst was over. The night grew quieter, and for a moment, it seemed like whatever had gripped him had passed. But it wasn't long before things took another bizarre turn. I was trying to sleep when I heard strange noises coming from his room. At first, it was just creaking, like the bed was shifting under his weight, but then there was this loud, metallic sound. Later, my parents told me they rushed to his room, and when they opened the door, they saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The metal headboard of his bed, solid and sturdy, was bent. He had somehow managed to twist it with his bare hands, and no one could explain how. The fear that had filled the house earlier came rushing back. My grandmother, worried sick, went to check on him. When she opened the door, she found something even worse. The floor near the bed was covered in this thick, green vomit. The smell was overpowering, so bad that she could barely stand to be in the room. It didn't seem natural at all, like nothing any of us had ever seen before. Everyone was on edge, unsure of what might happen next. The house felt tense, like it was holding its breath, waiting for more. But thankfully, the strange events finally began to die down. My uncle eventually fell into a deep sleep, and the night, though eerie and unsettling, grew quiet again. We were all left wondering what exactly had taken hold of him that night, and if it was truly gone. The next morning, things felt completely different, almost like the night before had been nothing but a bad dream. My uncle woke up in a good mood, acting like his usual self, with no memory of the terrifying things that had happened. He laughed and joked with everyone as if the night had never taken such a dark turn. But my grandmother, still uneasy, went to check on his room, worried about what she might find. She had seen the bent headboard and the strange mess on the floor the night before. But when she opened the door, everything was normal. There was no sign of the green vomit that had covered the floor, and the foul smell was completely gone. Even the headboard, which we all knew had been twisted out of shape, looked as solid and untouched as ever. It was as if nothing had happened at all. The rest of the family was just as puzzled, but no one wanted to talk about it too much. We were all shaken, unsure of how to make sense of what we had witnessed. Whatever had taken hold of my uncle that night, it felt like something far beyond our understanding. In the end, we decided not to tell him. There was no point in making him worry about something he couldn't even remember. But the memory of that night lingered with the rest of us, a reminder that some things just can't be explained. Even now, I still think about it and wonder what really happened, and if it could ever happen again. When I was about 10 years old, I spent a lot of time at home with my two sisters. For privacy, I'll just call my older sister Vanny and my younger sister Six. Six had become totally obsessed with a song called The Crooked Man by an artist named Kamaitashi. She played it on repeat, and I could hear it echoing through the house constantly. At first, I thought it was catchy, but after a while, it became a little unsettling. I've always had a fascination with the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, and all that. So one day, while the song was blaring in the background, I casually mentioned, if you say the crooked man 3 times, it could summon him. I didn't really think much of it. It was just something I'd read in a creepy story. Vanny, of course, didn't take me seriously. With a smirk on her face, she laughed and said, the crooked man, 3 times in a row, completely unfazed. I felt a surge of irritation. I knew there was something off about joking around with that kind of stuff. Six glanced at me, her expression shifting from playful to worried, and she quickly told Vanny, don't ever do that again. I could tell Six felt uneasy, and honestly, so did I. The air in the room felt thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we might have crossed a line. The next day, I went to my grandparents' house, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. It was a usual visit, but I couldn't shake off the strange feeling from the day before. In the morning, while I was getting breakfast, I overheard my grandmother talking to my grandfather about a nightmare she had the night before. She sounded genuinely frightened as she described it. I saw this tall man, about 2 meters tall, standing right by the main door, she said, her voice trembling. My heart sank at her words. The first thing that popped into my mind was the crooked man. I also thought of Slender Man, that creepy figure from the internet stories. I wanted to ask her more about what he looked like, but something stopped me. I didn't want to know. As I listened to her recount the details, a chill crept down my spine. The joke my sister had made felt far too real now, and the connection between her playful words and my grandmother's nightmare gnawed at me. It was as if we had awakened something we couldn't control. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, and I started to worry about what might happen next. The day after my grandmother's unsettling story, I found myself in the home office at my grandparents' house. It was a small space near the kitchen, and I was chatting with my cousins on Discord, trying to distract myself from everything that had happened. We were laughing and joking, but a nagging feeling lingered in the back of my mind. As I glanced toward the kitchen, something caught my eye outside. It was quick, a flash of movement behind a towel that was hanging in the yard. My heart raced, and I squinted to get a better look. I felt a chill run through me as I realized it wasn't just my imagination. There was definitely something there, hiding just out of sight. Startled, I instinctively reached for the light switch and flipped it on, illuminating the yard. But when I looked outside, I didn't see anything. Just the towel swaying slightly in the breeze. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond my vision. A wave of unease washed over me. I couldn't help but connect this strange experience to my sister's joke and my grandmother's nightmare. It was as if whatever we had summoned was now playing with us, and I began to genuinely worry that we had opened a door that shouldn't have been touched. Later that day, while I was still trying to process everything, my grandfather came into the kitchen looking a bit disheveled. I could tell something was off, and when I asked him if he was okay, he hesitated before answering. "I had a nightmare last night," he said, his voice low. Curiosity got the better of me, and I urged him to share. As he began to recount his dream, my heart sank further. He had woken up in the middle of the night in a dark room, feeling a sense of dread wash over him. He dreamt of a tall figure, just like the one my grandmother described. He had called out for my grandmother, his voice echoing in the silence, but when he looked around, there was only darkness. As he spoke, my mind raced. This couldn't be a coincidence. My sister's joke about summoning the crooked man suddenly felt so much more serious. It was like a weight had settled on my chest, and fear began to creep into every corner of my thoughts. How was it possible that both my grandparents had experienced the same terrifying figure in their dreams? I felt trapped in a nightmare of my own, and the sense that things were spiraling out of control overwhelmed me. I had never believed in the supernatural more than I did at that moment. I was convinced that whatever my sister had awakened was now affecting everyone around me, and I didn't know how to make it stop. A few days later, I was in the shower, trying to wash away the tension that had built up inside me. The steam filled the room, and I tried to focus on the warm water, hoping it would soothe my nerves. But as I turned my back to rinse off, I suddenly heard a noise, a soft thud followed by a slight clatter. Startled, I spun around, my heart racing. Behind me, an object lay on the floor, and I couldn't immediately tell where it had come from. It was a small round decoration that had somehow fallen, but there was nothing nearby that could have knocked it over. My first instinct was to brush it off as just the wind or maybe even my imagination playing tricks on me. Yet, deep down, I knew better. The eerie string of events that had been unfolding since my sister's joke replayed in my mind, one chilling moment after another. The figure my grandparents had seen in their nightmares, the strange movement outside the window, and now this. Each incident piled onto the last, leaving me feeling increasingly paranoid. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lurking just beyond my sight. The idea of the crooked man haunted my thoughts, an ever-present shadow in my life. I stepped out of the shower, wrapped myself in a towel, and took a deep breath, but that lingering fear refused to let go.